Turn in your Bibles to John chapter 11 today. John chapter 11. As we look at a message I've entitled, Raised to Life. We're going to go through the entire chapter today and Raised to Life. How many people are familiar with the term life hack? You heard of the term life hack? Okay. So a life hack is a strategy or a technique that helps you manage your time or your activities in a more efficient way. There's some examples of life hacks I want to show you. Maybe you've not seen this before, but if you want to get 2 bowls in a microwave at one time, that's how you do that. I don't know if you knew that or not. You're going to walk out of here having learned something today. That's how you can do that. Level up. Show the next one there. You're trying to move, get all your stuff packed, take a trash bag and cinch it up around all of your clothes and use those ties at the top to keep your hangers together. Next one, hands-free gas pumping. You knew that already. It's probably not the safest thing to do. Just stuff that little cap right underneath and just let it pump for you. Anybody see that? All right. Next one, ground beef. Took forever to defrost, right? But if you smash it out and make it a little bit thinner, you can actually defrost it quicker, right? This is maybe a great little life hack. Again, this is why you come to church, right? Good stuff like this. We're not going to stay here forever. One of my favorite life hacks, I hate peeling potatoes. And it's painful to have to sit there and peel potatoes to make mashed potatoes. So what I learned is that if you boil the potatoes in hot water, and then you shock them in cold water real quick, the skin will fall right off. Just comes right off. Shock them in cold water. I don't know if you knew that. Life hacks, right? That's one of my favorite. We are always trying to gain an efficiency, always looking for an angle, always looking for a competitive advantage, wrestling with the task of trying to make our burdens less burdensome. To which the gospel writer says, look no further than Jesus. Jesus is the ultimate life hack. He is the resurrection and the life. He doesn't just deal with the issue of death. He advances the cause of life. He takes your sin and He gives you His perfection. He takes your heavy burden and He gives you a light yoke. Before someone coined that term life hack, Jesus was offering a better way, namely Himself. Read with me as the story opens in verses 1 through 16. Now a man was sick, Lazarus from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped His feet with her hair, and it was her brother Lazarus who was sick. So the sisters sent a message to Him, Lord, the one you love is sick. When Jesus heard it, He said, this sickness will not end in death, but is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus, so that when He heard that he was sick, He stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. Then after that, He said to the disciples, let's go to Judea again. Rabbi, the disciples told Him, just now the Jews tried to stone you, and you're going there again? Aren't there 12 hours in a day? Jesus answered. If anyone walks during the day, he doesn't stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks during the night, he does stumble because the light is not in him. He said this, and then He told them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm on my way to wake him up. Then the disciples said to Him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he'll get well. Jesus, however, was speaking about his death because they thought He was speaking about natural sleep. So Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died. I'm glad for you that I wasn't there so that you may believe, but let's go to him. Then Thomas, called Twin, said to his fellow disciples, let's go too, so that we may die with him. So the sisters and Jesus had a deep and a meaningful connection. In fact, the whole family did. It wasn't just a one-sided relationship. It wasn't just them trying to get at Jesus. Jesus cared for them, and He gave them access to Him. In fact, He had learned through their communications that Lazarus had died. He wasn't just swooning. He wasn't just in a coma. He wasn't just sleeping deeply. He was dead. But Jesus makes it clear that he won't stay dead. In fact, his death is just an opportunity for the glory of God to be seen. I want you to think about the Old Testament glory of God, the Shekinah glory of God, this temple that would see the physical presence and the manifestation of God almost look like a fog that covered that temple. It was on the temple, it was the people of God, it was the mountain of God where the physical representation of God's glory could be seen. Jesus is going to do all of this in this chapter so that that physical manifestation of his glory might be seen. The death of Lazarus is going to give an opportunity for God to show himself off visibly, tangibly, unforgettably for his glory. And Jesus makes it clear in the 4th verse that the story of Lazarus, that he will live again. But now the issue is that in order to heal Lazarus, Jesus needs to go in person to cross back over to Judea so the people can see it. It's not that he couldn't have spoken a word and healed Lazarus, but he wanted to be there and he wanted to show off. And Judea was the place where the Jewish leadership had just tried to stone him. You remember at the end of chapter 10, they were trying to stone him. And the disciples know this and they're like, hey, you're going to go back there? This is hostile territory. In fact, in verse 8, they say, hey, they just tried to stone you. Why are you going there again? But Jesus is pretty adamant that he's going to go there again. He wants to demonstrate God's glory in raising Lazarus from the dead so that people might believe, but also the disciples might believe as well. And knowing that they were walking into hostile territory, Thomas says in verse 16, let's go too so that we may die with him. Like he's going to be noble and show his loyalty to Jesus by going to die with him. In verse 17, the story continues. When Jesus had arrived, he found that Lazarus was dead, had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, less than 2 miles away. Many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them about their brother. As soon as Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Then Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Yet even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Your brother will rise again, Jesus told her. And Martha said to him, I know that he'll rise in the resurrection at the last day. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me, even if he dies, will live. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she told him. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God who comes into the world. So Jesus heard the news of his death in verse 3, but he stayed 2 more days in his current location before he goes to see Lazarus. So he arrives 4 days after his burial. Jesus' patience defies all expectation here. But even as Jesus works at his own pace, Martha recognizes that Jesus has the power to bring her brother back to life. She recognizes that if Jesus was there, it could have prevented his death in the first place. But even now, as she asks God, the power of God for anything, it will be granted. And Jesus offers her those words of comfort in verse 23. Your brother will rise again. I am the resurrection and the life. That's our main idea this morning. Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Jesus is the resurrection and the life. Martha was focusing on the resurrection of the end times, right? The day of the Lord. And that's still going to happen. But Jesus is affirming to her, he doesn't dismiss her theological claim, but he's affirming to her, I am the resurrection and the life right here in front of you. It's not merely reserved for a day in the future, it's also here in the present. The resurrection and the life personified by the person of Jesus Christ. Now, the resurrection normally applies to something occurring in the future. Life normally applies to something here in the present, but I want you to see them as a paradox. The resurrection isn't just something happening in the future, it's happening right now. We just sang it. The resurrected King is resurrecting me. It's a constant process of sanctification. It's happening right now. And the life isn't just something happening now, it's also something that's going to happen after this life, right? Eternal life. Perhaps Martha made her statement about her brother rising on the day of the Lord to comfort herself. But Jesus offers her comfort not in the future, but in his presence right now. The future hope of the Jews is a present reality for Christians. The future hope of the Jews is a present reality for Christians. And Jesus says, the one who believes in me, even if he dies, will live. Even in our death, there is life. And that life is available, as verse 26, to everyone who lives and believes in me. Who lives and believes in me. Believing is reserved for those who are living. Believing is reserved for those who are living. Eternal life is reserved for those who believe in this life. Living in Jesus isn't a call to a higher form of life. It's a call to a different type of life. Those who are living in Jesus live differently than those who are without him. One commentator says, faith in Jesus does not make humans immortal. What it does bring about is that from that moment on, they will no longer live under the power of death. And Jesus asked the question, do you believe this? And Martha says in verse 27, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God who comes into the world. I want you to notice the similarity between Martha's response in verse 27 and Peter's response to Jesus in Matthew 16. In Matthew 16:16, Peter says, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And in verse 17, Jesus responds, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. Upon the confession of Peter, Jesus is going to build his church. Upon the confession of Martha, Jesus is going to build his church. Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. That's the message of the church. That's our competitive advantage. It's the thing that makes us unique and the thing that makes us strong. Upon that confession, Jesus is Lord. He's going to build his church, and the gates of hell won't prevail against it. Martha has confessed her belief, right? But Mary's still back at the house, and the story continues in verse 28. Having said this, she went back and called her sister Mary, saying in private, the teacher is here and is calling for you. As soon as Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. And Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw that Mary got up quickly and went out. They followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to cry there. As soon as Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and told him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Mary has a similar response to Martha here. Lord, if you had only been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And in some ways, these responses are kind of passive-aggressive rebukes of Jesus. If you had only been here, this wouldn't have happened. But for both women, they also express some measure of faith as well, right? Martha by exclaiming, if Jesus asks God, God will grant it. Mary by falling at his feet in some kind of tearful worship. You see this kind of being mad at God, but still worshiping God here. Verse 33, when Jesus saw her crying, and the Jews who had come with her crying, he was deeply moved in his spirit and troubled. She was crying in verse 33. Those that came with her were crying, and Jesus was deeply moved and troubled. The word translated here, deeply moved, can also mean outraged or angry. So when you see that word deeply moved, know that it encompasses kind of the spectrum of emotions. It's outrage, it's anger, it's grief. Was Jesus outraged at the response of the sisters? Or was Jesus grieving over the death of his friend Lazarus? Or was Jesus angry at the sin in the world that led to that death? Yes. All of the above. Yes. Grieving isn't just sorrow. And it's not just anger. It's all of those emotions rolled up into one. Jesus was not some uncaring and unsympathetic Messiah. He was moved, he was troubled, he felt emotion, but he didn't just remain as an emotional feeling. It translated to an outward expression. In verse 34, "Where have you put him?" he asked. "Lord," they told him, "come and see." Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Couldn't he who opened the blind man's eyes also have kept this man from dying?" Verse 35, Jesus wept. Shortest verse in the Bible. Shortest possible construction of a sentence. But the fact that it's the shortest verse in the Bible, that's just good for Trivial Pursuit. It really doesn't carry the meaning of the text. Because after all, books, chapters, verses, those were things that were added to the scriptures after the fact in the 1200s. They're not divinely inspired. And so the fact that this is the shortest verse in the Bible isn't something that God is trying to draw our attention to. What he is trying to emphasize here is the emotion felt and the emotion displayed on the part of Jesus. Jesus didn't just feel troubled, he displayed that feeling. To this point in the book, the gospel writer has gone out of his way to make sure that we know Jesus is God. But in this moment, he takes the time to remind us that even as God, he was still a man. Fully God, fully man. So much so that he wept. The people recognized that Jesus cared for Lazarus because of his weeping, but even though they saw him crying, they could not understand the Romans 8 height and depth of his love. How do I know that? Because even in his mourning, they still question why he who healed the blind man couldn't have kept this man from dying. But Jesus isn't done being Jesus yet. Verse 38, it says this, "Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and the stone was lying against it. 'Remove the stone,' Jesus said. Martha, the dead man's sister, told him, 'Lord, there is already a stench because he has been dead 4 days.' And Jesus said to her, 'Didn't I tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?' So they removed the stone. Then Jesus raised his eyes and said, 'Father, I thank you that you heard me. I know that you always hear me. But because of the crowd standing here, I said this so that they may believe you sent me.' And after he said this, he shouted with a loud voice, 'Lazarus, come out.' And the dead man came out, bound hand and foot with linen strips, and with his face wrapped in a cloth. And Jesus said to them, 'Unwrap him and let him go.'" Family burial plots were not far from the house. So they would be on the family land. They would be close enough to the house to be accessible, but far enough away so that they wouldn't create a ritual impurity with those who lived in the house. And the stone was simply there to keep animals away from the body, and to some degree limit the stench that would come from that body. Those that were buried there would be wrapped in linen to prevent a premature distortion of the body. So these linen cloths would be wrapped super tight like saran wrap. So Jesus knows this, and in fact, he commands them to take the linen strips off of them. I want you to imagine this scene. This grave was probably a horizontal grave. When Jesus tells Lazarus to come out, you've got this body tightly wrapped. I mean, he's saran wrapped up. Jesus says, "Come out." Lazarus he's doing this number, right? He's wiggling his way out of that grave, that horizontal grave, having to exert so much energy, proving, in fact, that he is now alive. Martha, known for being the practical one, was worried about the smell. Jesus wasn't concerned for the smell, he was concerned for God's glory. Martha thought Jesus' miracle was limited to those being alive. Here, Jesus reminds her that he is the resurrection and the life. We think about all the ways that it can't be done, don't we? God isn't confined by those limitations. We see the limitation. God sees the outcome. And what happens as a result of this miracle? Verses 45 and 46, "Therefore many of the Jews who came to Mary and saw what he did believed in him. Some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Many believed, some went and played tattletale." But this news when they received it by the Jewish leadership, wasn't received well. They construct a plot to kill Jesus in verses 47 and 48. So the chief priests and the Pharisees convened the Sanhedrin and were saying, "What are we going to do since this man is doing many signs? If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." Two different groups here, high priests and the Pharisees. The high priests were associated with the Sadducees, and then you had the Pharisees. Now, they saw things very different theologically, namely the issue of the resurrection. They were in different tribes, right? So think Democrat and Republican. But all of a sudden, they got a common enemy in Jesus, and they get together. And they can't even call him by his name. They say, "This man." This wasn't just about politics at this point, it was personal. And let's be clear, this issue was never about whether Jesus was God. This was about power and influence. Their concern was not about Jesus' actual identity, nor whether God would be pleased or displeased with them. Their concern was their position and whether Rome would allow them to maintain all of the things that they had if they started seeing some guy named Jesus proclaimed as king instead of Caesar. In the middle of their meeting, the high priest speaks up. Verse 49, one of them, Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all. You're not considering that it is to your advantage that one man should die for the people rather than the whole nation perish." He did not say this on his own, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation. And not for the nation only, but also to unite the scattered children of God. So from that day on, they plotted to kill him. Jesus, therefore, no longer walked openly among the Jews, but departed from there to the countryside near the wilderness, to a town called Ephraim, and he stayed there with the disciples. Now the Jewish Passover was near, and many went up to Jerusalem from the country to purify themselves before the Passover. They were looking for Jesus and asking one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think? He won't come to the festival, will he?" The chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, he should report it so that they could arrest him. Even with the Passover going on, Jesus is still the center of attention. They're still talking about him under their breath. They're standing around wondering if he's going to come. And Caiaphas seeks to take the attention of Rome off of the nation of Israel and redirect it to one person. Make Jesus a Roman problem and let them do the dirty work for us. Caiaphas was the high priest in that year that the plot was hatched, that year that Jesus died. That year, Caiaphas correctly prophesied about Jesus' sacrifice. Caiaphas was the high priest in that year. Jesus is the great high priest for all time. One man would die for the people, not just for the nation, but for the scattered children of God, and it is to your advantage. Jesus is the resurrection and the life. There's some debate over whether the Lazarus featured in this story is the same Lazarus in Luke 16 with the parable of the rich man. But there's no connection thematically, and Lazarus was a pretty common name. And even though Lazarus was the beneficiary of the miracle in this story is not really focused on him. This story is about the interactions between Mary and Martha and Jesus. The miracle is not featured in any of the other Gospels. It's not in Matthew, it's not in Mark, it's not in Luke. And yet it's one of Jesus' most spectacular miracles. Critics will point to this and question the authenticity of the miracle. Christians will look at this feature and they'll wonder why. But to the critics who question its authenticity, to what end, right? Why? What would be materially changed about the life and testimony of Jesus if you were to extract this miracle from the gospel? Nothing, because Jesus has already declared his deity. John has already demonstrated his humanity. So its omission from the other gospels is immaterial. And to the Christians who wondered why it's not included in the other gospels, you'll just have to continue and wonder. The rest of the scriptures make no attempt to synthesize this, and I'm not going to either. But I do want you to know this. The Gospel of John refers to miracles as signs. Signs serve as signposts, pointing us to the ultimate sign in the resurrection. John is methodically and theologically walking us to the cross and the empty tomb, unlike the other Gospels. The death of Jesus removes the death. Jesus removes the death from Lazarus, even when he doesn't remove it from himself. In a moment, in John 11, Jesus gives one man life. In a moment on the cross, Jesus extends that offer of life to the whole world, not just to one man. So, such a big miracle obviously demands a response on our part. So let's look at some application this morning for the text. 3 points. Number 1, mourn. Mourn. Romans 12:15 reminds us to weep with those who weep. Matthew 5:4 says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." Too often, we demand that people hurry up and get over it, as if just a few days of funeral planning will do the trick. Our American tendency towards expediency totally undermines the mourning process. And understand that mourning isn't just about death. Sometimes you're mourning over a job. Sometimes you're mourning over the loss of a relationship. Sometimes you're mourning over a prodigal child. Mourning happens in a lot of different circumstances, and we do ourselves no favor when we tell people just to hurry up and get over it. Jesus' empathy here is noteworthy. His tears and his presence offered more than just his words alone. Weep with those who weep. Mourn with those who mourn. Secondly, intercede. Intercede. I want you to notice in verse 41, Jesus says, "I thank you that you've heard me." Heard, past tense. Before Jesus prayed in public, he was praying in private. Jesus was interceding for this family in private leading up to this day. Hebrews 7:25 was evidenced in this story. Jesus is right now seated at the right hand of the Father, interceding on your behalf. So go to him. Pray to him for yourself, for your family, for your church, for your world. Your public prayer life will never exceed your private prayer life. Mourn, intercede, and then thirdly, focus on God. Focus on God. H.B. Charles is one of my favorite preachers I like to listen to, and he tells this story about a young preacher who at like 17 or 18 was kind of wanting to dust off some of his introductory books on preaching and pastoral ministry, and there was a member of his congregation who had died, and so he goes to make this home visit to be with the family as they mourn the death of a loved one, and it was an elderly lady who he was going to visit with. And in that interaction, this young preacher wants to show off all of the things he's learned about biblical counseling, and wants to show off all the different platitudes that he can say, and wants to be a comfort to this family. And what the elderly lady who was mourning the loss of her husband wanted from him, and she told him this, is I just need a big picture of God. Don't give me your platitudes. Don't tell me how it's going to be okay. Don't tell me how God's got this. Show me God. When people are mourning, they don't need your Dr. Phil wisdom. What they need is a big picture of a big God. And when you focus on that, everything else falls into place. So focus on God's love. The love of God in verse 5 goes together with the lack of action by God in verse 6. Nobody knows why Jesus waited 2 more days before he went to see Lazarus. But we cannot see his delay as unloving because of verse 5. The threat and experience of sickness and death for the Christian must not be viewed as a betrayal of God's love. You see that? If God lets you stay in the hospital an extra day, if God takes someone that you love away from you, it's not unloving. Focus on God. Look to the glory of God rather than your circumstance. Focus on God's empathy. Jesus is the God who weeps. Hebrews 4:15 says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin." When we see Jesus weep, we see a crystal clear picture of God's empathy. Focus on the plan of God. God uses the evil of Caiaphas for the good of his people. Kind of reminds us of Genesis 50, doesn't it? Joseph and his brothers. What you meant for evil, God used for good. God is good, and his plan is good. And your faith isn't in your ability to control things. Your faith is in the God who already knows what's going to happen tomorrow, right? The God who controls all things is working all things together for the good of those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. So I ask you, as Jesus asked her, do you believe this? Do you believe this? Deuteronomy 30:19, Moses says, "I call heaven and earth as witnesses against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life, so that you and your descendants may live." To which Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life. Choose me."